Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Redditors with schizophrenia. What were some of the first signs that you felt that something was off? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'll start off with the disclaimer that my official diagnosis is schizoaffective, which is on the bipolar schizophrenia spectrum, if you buy into that model. Psychiatry is still kind of confused as to how to handle patients that present with symptoms of a mood disorder and psychosis, as I understand it. Anyway, it took me a long time to come to grips with it. My family and friends had noted me acting more distant or confused, but it wasn't until I went through my entire library, flipping my books around because I thought there were bugs in their spines, that I was ready to admit that I might actually be dealing with something. Before that, everything I was doing made sense to me. Even in retrospect, it's difficult to filter my own disordered reasoning out of my memories. That was my reality. Still is sometimes. So I don't know that I could even tell you what the signs were. It's challenging to get completely out of that state of mind, although some days are better than others. I grew up with a father who is severely schizophrenic and has manic depression. Some of the biggest things I recall: 1, his intelligence. My father had an exceptional ability to retain and recite information. He was an endless source of trivia. Granted, he would actually talk, which brings me to 2, he was quiet. The man rarely spoke. It was like pulling teeth with him just to get something out to him. To this day, he's the same way. I made calls to him and usually talked to myself for sometimes over an hour and never got more than a yeah or okay. 3, his temper. My father was quick to snap and was extremely irrational and delusional. One time, for instance, he was driving down the road and was convinced the guy behind him was trailing him. He actually pulled a knife out, slowed down, and when the driver caught up, he looked over and dragged the blade across his throat as a threat to that driver. There were plenty of other occurrences like this over the years. 4, he had no desire to amount to anything. His apartment was messy. He took hours preparing himself just to even go out and grab food. He was a complete recluse, and to this day sleeps most of the day. I've made several attempts at trying to share this with you guys, but there's just so much that I'm having a hard time putting into words. Long story short, his last breakdown happened when he took himself off his meds. He was found in another person's apartment in his underwear, claiming aliens were after him. He was arrested and hospitalized shortly after for a long time. My aunt, his sister, eventually fought off the charges and pay for him to be in a group home now, where he is monitored 24/7 and is made sure to be taking his medicine. I still make calls to him, but they're the same. He has a grandson now, and I try so hard to get him interested, but he just doesn't care. I've slowly called him less and less because I end up just crying whenever I hang up. He's just not there anymore because he's so medicated. Ever since his hospitalization, he just doesn't even seem alive. Again, sorry for being vague. There's too much I'd like to share, but it's hard on mobile to write as quickly as it's coming. If you suspect someone of having schizophrenia, get them help. It is not a joke or something to be taken lightly. It has single-handedly stolen my father away from me. One of my best friends gave up on real women around the age of 21 and started imaginary relationships with anime characters in his head because of the stress. I tell him they weren't real and he'd say I'm better off this way. He says when he gets really stressed, the voices start coming back, including one time when he asked me to go home while we were watching a movie because there were 2 people talking and a woman singing opera and he couldn't hear. As far as I know, he hasn't had any problems in a while, but he could just be tired of telling me about it. He distanced himself from the whole world and lives a pretty dull, routine life to keep himself sane. He's a normal guy now, except it feels like he's living in a constant fear of losing control again. He's completely unmedicated and refused to get assessed or even talk to a medical professional about it, and we kinda just don't talk about it anymore. I really started to notice it my junior year of high school. I got on a bus to go home and started to freak out and assumed everyone on the bus was out to get me. It sounds horribly cliche, but honestly, the paranoia was terrible. I just assumed I was having an anxiety attack or something, not uncommon for me. About 2 or 3 weeks later, I practically sprinted off a bus for the same thing and was mentally screaming at myself to stay away from anyone. Except the mental screaming wasn't me, it just was there, yelling. These events started to get more and more common until at one point, like toward the end of my senior year, I noticed that the glass of water that I was drinking was like foaming and bubbling. I set it down very carefully and went to show my mom, but when I turned back around, it was perfectly normal, just a glass of water. It was the first time I'd actually told someone about a hallucination I was having, because before I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I just thought my anxiety was getting worse. After my mom saw how freaked out I was about the water, she took me to a doctor who confirmed that what I was experiencing was not normal. I have to say, when I look back now, it's glaringly obvious. I think my biggest setback in realizing what was going on is that my own brain didn't want to believe it had a problem. So I just never set too much stock in it. For me, it was when I started noticing some of the positive symptoms for what they were, a break from reality. It was the belief that I was being constantly observed by someone, or that when I was on public transport, believing that the people that glanced at me were able to read my thoughts. So I would focus on the lyrics of a song and repeat them constantly so they couldn't hear them. I was 15 at the time, and my parents noticed that something was off because of the negative symptoms, not wanting to go out, sleeping during the day, and being awake during the night, and not leaving my room except to eat something or go to the bathroom. I went to see a doctor, and she started me on some medication, which I accepted because I knew that taking medication but not leaving the house, and then going to a rehabilitation center for almost 2 years for people with mental illness, where I met a bunch of fun and funny people with the same problems as me, and made some great stories with them. Then I started going to school to become a computer technician, and am currently finishing my web development degree. Currently I take 1 pill a day and an injection once every 14 days, and I'm symptom-free. Only under very stressful situations does a little of the paranoia come back, but I'm able to identify it when it happens and not let it take over. Also, when I was alone at home, I would hear the doorbell go off when it was silent, and would go to answer the door and no one would be there. It was an auditory hallucination, and I got so fed up with it that I wouldn't answer the door because most of the time it was just in my head. Also, met my best friend in that rehabilitation center 7 years ago. We've been hanging out all the time since then. He has the same illness as me, and when his symptoms reappear, he believes that his parents are against him, so he shows up at my house at the wee hours of the morning to hang out and talk. I just sit there on the balcony with him and listen to him talk and say things that don't make sense and things that aren't true about his parents, and just listen to him because it's what he needs to feel better. You can't tell a person that's having a delusion that what he believes is not real because it's his mind that's making him believe it, and his mind is him. And if you go against him, then the person won't feel relaxed around you. You have to just be there. Sorry for not sticking exactly to the question, but I wanted to show the good part of getting better, and that it's only scary when you're in the deep end of it. But as you come out of it, the people you meet along the way and the stuff you do is the positive part of it. I think the best part is when you're in a group telling each other the stuff that happened to you because of your peculiar symptoms, and everybody is laughing and having a good time because of the crazy stories. And you can laugh at stuff like that few years ago was very stressful. Just wanted to tell my positive side of having schizophrenia.
You have a great attitude and approach toward this all, and I appreciate the information. I know it was a long one, but great. Thank you. I hope everything's going well.
My diagnosis is catatonic schizophrenia. For those who don't know, it means that I will go through periods of time where I will be overly energetic, unable to stop moving regardless of how hard I try. My muscles won't let me. However, I will also have periods when I have lower amounts of energy and cannot bring myself to move. Not like with depression, where you lack the will to move, but I physically cannot bring myself to move. In my experience, that is the scarier of the two. I'm left alone with my thoughts and the voices, unable to distract myself by doing something. As for the question that OP had asked, I didn't necessarily have any what I thought at the time or a major indication of what I deal with now on a daily basis. I started hearing this woman's voice that would be screaming what normally would be my inner thoughts in my inner voice. But as a kid with an active imagination, 9-year-old me didn't think anything of it, although I can still remember to this day that voice and the way she screamed what should have been my thoughts. The first sign that I knew I needed help was when I had my first episode where I blacked out and couldn't remember anything. I came to holding a knife to my throat with the voices telling me that I wouldn't amount to anything and should kill myself. I was 11 when that happened. As a kid that had a fairly nice upbringing, it scares the living shit out of me. So much so that I worked to completely forget about it and move on. My next sign was when I was 12. I had almost forgotten what had happened and was just going on with my life. I was sitting in class, and as any guy entering puberty, I would get random bouts of anger, not really doing anything about it, just being upset temporarily. But this time was different. I heard a voice that wasn't mine and wasn't the woman whom I'd had heard occasionally since the episode. It was my father's voice. He kept telling me to take my pencil and stab the person next to me, who happened to be my best friend at the time. Well, I knew that I shouldn't do that, so I didn't. The voice instantly went irate, telling me to do it, but I kept telling myself to not. So he started saying to punch him dead in the face, that my friend had been talking about me, and to get revenge. So as a kid who greatly looked up to my dad, I would do almost anything he said. I got my friend's attention and punched him right on the bridge of his nose, ending up making his nose bleed pretty badly. As soon as I did it, the voice went away, and I had immediately knew I shouldn't have done that. I apologized profusely and helped him out, telling him I had been having a bad day. We made up after that, and life went on. At 14, I had started to grow accustomed to the random voices that would just come and go. I thought nothing of it. It was just my imagination, and I am perfectly sane. At 14, I had my first catatonic episode. I was sitting at the movies with a group of close friends watching some movie that I can't remember at this point. During the movie, I had started to hear a voice that I hadn't heard in almost 2 years. The woman. She wasn't angry, though. She was calm. I had an entire conversation with her during the movie, barely watching the movie once I heard her. At some point in the movie, I started to fall asleep, being uninterrupted in the movie, and the voice was gone. I blacked out during that time, and according to my friends, had never actually fallen asleep. I just stared at the screen, not moving an inch. My arm was in what had to be the most uncomfortable position, and I had a blank look on my face. My friends had tried to move me, but I seemed unresponsive. I was in my own little world, they said, and I had no idea. My biggest wake-up call that something was wrong with me was the reason I actually went and got diagnosed came when I was 15. 4 years after my first episode, the voices were a normal part of my life. and I had accepted them, embraced them, and to some extent loved them. I had started to isolate myself from everybody just so I couldn't be judged and called crazy. I'd always heard about people having visual hallucinations, but never thought it would happen to me, as they are fairly uncommon and normally a sign of something else, but against all of my beliefs, it happened. My walls started dripping blood just like that out of nowhere. I looked down to try not to see any of it, and I saw blood profusely running down my arm, and once again, it scared the shit out of me, which actually made me snap and finally act on the suicidal thoughts I had for so long. I grabbed a kitchen knife and started cutting my arm. I managed to get a 2-inch, nice-sized cut into my arm, and then someone knocked on my door, making me snap back to reality. The blood on the walls was gone, but now I had 2 deep gashes on my arm that I was completely ashamed of. I hadn't done any real damage, luckily, but I still can't, and I carry those scars. Soon after that, I came clean to my best friend and his older sister, and they agreed to help me confidentially meet with a doctor to find out what was going on with me. This doctor was also their mom, who just happened to be a psychologist. I asked her not to mention anything to my parents, as it would devastate them, and she swore she wouldn't. Patient confidentiality and whatnot. I told her everything, down to the first episode was going on with me, and the woman before that. She explained what was going on and offered to help me, which I politely turned down, being that I didn't want to feel dependent on anybody other than myself. Now at 18, I've stayed non-medicated, but I still struggle every single day to overcome this near constant voice and visions that will come and go unannounced and unprecedentedly. But I've noticed my amazing girlfriend, and things aren't seeming to be getting better. I need a positive outlook. I have come to realize that this illness is a part of me, just as much as the personality and appearance are, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. I hope I helped answer some questions that you might have had, OP, and any that anybody else might have had. I have generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder to begin with, but it's starting to get much worse. I'm going to a doctor this week for further evaluation, but I'll tell you pretty much what has been happening. For around 2 months, I've been struggling to differentiate between my dreams and reality. Not like really unrealistic dreams, and I know when I'm walking up and falling down, and falling asleep in bed at night, and can't tell if they're real or thoughts and memories, and can't tell if they're real or if I dreamt them. It's getting frustrating because I can't tell what has happened and what hasn't unless someone can confirm. I also have been catching conversations with myself, really intricate ones with imaginary people like I did as a kid, and sometimes it slips out in public, and it's embarrassing, and then I have to get away before a panic attack envelops me. The last thing I've been struggling with is a constant fear of someone trying to drug me. I mean, it's so bad. I lock my door when I walk the 50 feet to my mailbox, because if I don't, I'm positive someone will quickly run into my apartment and drug my water in my water bottle. It took me a while to admit to myself the fact that I was having mental problems when the anxiety first started 4 years ago because of the terrible stigma of mental illness. But I'm glad I got help, and anyone going through a hard time should do the same. I'm also lucky to have had such supportive friends and family, and if you tell them about your mental health issues and they leave you, you're better off without them. Just remember, society considers me a crazy person, but it's not like I'm dangerous or anything. I like to ride my bicycle, go to the movies, go skiing, hang out with friends, and on really good days, maybe go out on a Friday night with them. I'm also really shy, and I like to think of myself as a nice person. Wow, This is the most I've told any stranger about my mental state, but that just felt really good. I just want to say something. If anyone is hearing voices when they're trying to sleep, it is very possible that it is not a mental illness, more so if it's when you're really close to sleep. I've looked it up because I have this. It happens mostly when I'm really busy all day, and it's right when I'm falling asleep. You know that state when you're not all the way sleeping, but you're starting to dream? It happens there, or right before there. And it is a fairly common thing, so don't worry. Most people have this and shake it off because they don't sweat it, and neither should you. Worrying is your worst enemy. The more I think about how I get it at night, the more I get it. Now I think of it, I haven't had it in a long time, and I probably will tonight because I'm thinking about it. Don't worry. Unless it seems to be really bad and all the time, use discretion, and try not to let it get to you too much. I've wasted so much of my life worrying about whether or not I have this or that or blah blah blah. And one thing that calms me surprisingly is telling myself that there is absolutely nothing I can do to prevent any of it, except for drug use. Don't do drugs. And if it does become a problem, I will deal with it. In the meantime, I'm going to enjoy life. Sorry if this is irrelevant, but I'd bet money that a lot of Redditors are having some sort of anxiety attack going through this thread, and I kind of am too, and that's okay, because I will get over it. Know that nobody knows everything. It seems scary at first, but it will calm you eventually, and the people that do have these illnesses still live with it. It makes life harder, but they're still alive and do have good moments. Hopefully this helped anyone having some sort of anxiety in this thread. If not, then I'm sorry for wasting your time. My ex-girlfriend has schizoaffective disorder. I first noticed it when she'd start an argument with me over something that I totally didn't do or say. She'd be like, "You disrespected me in front of everyone. You always embarrass me." If we were out at a bar or something, she'd always tell me that she overheard strangers talk shit about her. Things got worse over time. A few times a month, she'd have a catastrophic breakdown. Usually her delusions would focus on me. She'd think that I really wasn't who I told her I was. She thought I was out to get her or that I was dating her to spy on her for the government. She'd have full-blown panic episodes, and the theme was always the same. She said she could hear people talking about her and narrating her life, even if it was just me and her in a room. She was convinced that she had some ability to read people's minds or had like a psychic link with her enemies, kind of like Harry Potter and Voldemort. Oof. When she'd come to her senses, she'd be terrified people hated her because of her condition. She'd cry about losing me and her friends. She thought about her presence itself was poisonous to other people, that we were repulsed by her. She even quoted a Nine Inch Nails song called Reptile to explain what she thought. Angels bleed from the tainted touch of my caress. So many times we'd be lying in bed, and I'd try as hard as I could to comfort her. I'd hold her and tell her that I loved her, and that our love would defeat her condition. We'd have a few good weeks, and then the cycle would repeat again. This happened for about a year until I just withdrew and couldn't deal with it anymore. And when she saw that I didn't want to hang out, she broke up with me. I still feel a lot of guilt for that, but I had my own life, and I couldn't take care of her anymore. When I was 16, I heard voices in my head, but my case seems to be distinctly different from other people who experienced psychosis. My experience was quite nice. I had two different voices. One was a female who was friendly, kind, and a best friend. She was like a sister, but a part of me always suspected she was me from the future. Her name was Ariel. There was also a man, Alex, who was mean and scary, like a disapproving authority figure. Most of the time, it was Ariel, and we just talked about normal things like music and books. She had her own distinct tastes. She didn't like my favorite band, for example. I didn't talk out loud to her. I just thought things, and she would hear Alex's voice was far more distant, less loud, and less in my face, like someone yelling at me from another room. Generally, this experience was actually positive for me, and it felt so real, and they felt so different from me that I didn't accept that it was likely a symptom of mental illness until I was in my 30s. Normally in pop culture, when you hear about voices, they make someone do bad things or run screaming naked down the street or something. But mine were just like friends. I wasn't diagnosed with schizophrenia. I've had lots of diagnoses over the years, such as bipolar, depression, anxiety, and BPD. Should I have sought medical intervention at this time, I think a diagnosis of schizophrenia would have been likely. I didn't tell anyone about this for a very long time because I knew they would say it's psychosis, and I sincerely, genuinely believed they were real. I didn't want anyone taking them away from me to discredit that experience. I haven't experienced psychosis since that time. I think it only hung around for a year or so. I miss Ariel. I wish she were still around. My older brother is severely schizophrenic. We didn't really get along when we were kids, as he would pick fights with me, and when we were in high school, would regularly beat the shit out of me. He was always kind of off, in that he would have sudden emotional outbursts at home or school. After he graduated high school, he joined the Navy. He stayed in for a year and was eventually medically discharged for reasons he doesn't really seem to want to talk about, so I wouldn't bring it up. After he got home, we began to get along for the first time since we were toddlers, but when his schizophrenia began manifesting, his mood became unstable again. When my mom told me she thought he might have schizophrenia, I didn't believe it. I thought he was just being the same asshole he always was. Eventually, I heard him having a full-on conversation with himself while in the shower, and I realized that there might be a chance he was ill. I tried to be supportive after that and told him he could always talk to me. However, he started to become angry and violent with me. If I was standing in front of the television, he would punch me as hard as he could. He would sock me in the face because he blamed me for a bag of his chips getting stale. By the way, I'm 5'7" and my brother is 5'10", and he outweighed me by 20 to 30 pounds at the time. I would try to shrug these occurrences off because I knew that something wasn't right with him. But eventually, this led to us brawling in the living room of our mother's house, and me slamming his head against the fireplace, so he stopped being violent with me after that. Afterwards, I joined the army, so I wasn't around when his illness really started to kick in. My mom would tell me little bits occasionally, like he would hole up in his closet screaming, I'm sorry. He thought he could talk to spirits or angels. He thought our dad R'd him, and I was honorably discharged. I moved with my then girlfriend to Texas and kept hearing bits and pieces. At some point, he beat up our 60-year-old stepfather. After our stepdad temporarily moved out, my brother slapped our mom around, and my parents were able to have him committed after that. About a year ago, I moved back to California. My brother was living in a group home for people with mental illness. At the time, he seemed a lot better. He was going to school and even seemed to be making friends. At some point, he managed to get out of that place since my parents had no legal way at the time, and he moved into a house with some other dudes. He immediately quit taking his meds, which led to him hallucinating, and he became convinced he was a prophet, I think at least. When my dad and I went to go visit him, he would be chain-smoking in the backyard, pacing back and forth clutching his Bible. It was very apparent that he hadn't bathed in a few days or changed his clothes. I could only guess what his roommates thought. After that, we managed to move him back to his group home, where he stayed for a while. Fairly recently, he beat up his then roommate and even broke his guitar over the poor guy's head because he thought he was trying to R him. His handicapped, incontinent, 90-pound roommate. Anyway, he was committed again and kicked out of that particular group home, which brings us up to the present. We got him into a different group home, which is in a kind of shitty section of town, but at least seems fairly relaxed. Since he'd been there, He'd jump out of the second-story window a handful of times for different reasons. Maybe if he keeps doing it, he'll get kicked out, and my parents will be forced to get him on his own apartment. He's aggravated by the neighbors. Recently, he believed he's training to be in the CIA, and they're going to recruit him in a month. And he tried to strangle his new roommate while the dude was sleeping because he thought he was trying to R him. On a positive note, somehow my dad was able to get him VA benefits since he was able to make a case that his training in the Navy may have triggered his illness due to stress. So my brother is currently under the care of the psychiatrist ward of the local VA hospital. It's upsetting to think about because my brother was a pretty smart guy and seemed to have a lot going for him. But we're just striving and trying to do the best that we can and trying to make sure he's okay. He's extremely lucky that his family is so supportive, because otherwise he'd be any other homeless guy mumbling to himself down the street.